Before we get going, I just wanted to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land on which we're sitting today, the Malakadi people, pay my respects to their elders past and present, and acknowledge that their land has never been ceded. And I feel like a lot of these topics today are really relevant to traditional foodways and where regen ag can intersect with their knowledge. And I find this sort of next era of Indigenous foodways and regenerative agriculture is a really exciting time for humanity. So let's hear more about the exciting topics of hemp today. We've got Tim Crow with us. Tim's going to introduce himself and talk to us about hemp. And the question is, hemp is dope. So Tim, tell us about yourself. Like, where did you come from? Today, where are you from? And how did you get into hemp as a thing? And we'll go from there.
Okay, thank you. So I guess just a show of hands, does anyone here know about hemp? Does anyone have much of an idea? Okay, yeah. You're probably surprised that the guy's talking about hemp doesn't have dreadlocks or a Rastafarian cap, but things have really changed in the industry of late. So I guess quick intro on me. I've been in the industry for about 8 years now. I've got a hemp seed processing facility in northern Tasmania, so we create a range of different hemp food ingredients, and we've got farmers that we work with across the state and in different states as well, across Australia as well. I've also sort of helped set up medical cannabis facilities in Australia, and I've worked a little bit in the fibre space, in the hemp fibre space as well, which I'll get more into later. I was also recently awarded a Churchill Fellowship, where I was lucky enough to travel around through 9 countries around the world to sort of understand the global landscape for hemp and just sort of understand the things that are limiting the growth of the industry and it reaching its potential, and sort of to understand where I guess Australia sits within the future landscape of the industrial hemp industry. So that's sort of a brief on me. I've also been involved in the Australian Hemp Council, the Tasmanian Hemp Association. So I guess I've sort of had my hands in all parts of the hemp supply chain. Hemp. So hemp is like, what is hemp? Hemp is cannabis. Shocking, but cannabis is basically the botanical name, and hemp is a classification within the cannabis. The cannabis plant. So hemp is all varieties with less than 1% THC. THC being the compound that gets you high, that's the intoxicating compound. And so, for example, in recreational or illicit cannabis, you're talking 20 to 25% THC, whereas hemp has less than 1%. So that's a general classification of what hemp is. But hemp can be grown for seeds. So that's what I focus on, and the seeds have, in their whole form, the seeds are about 25% protein, they're about 30% fat, and they're really high in fiber and sort of vitamins and minerals as well. And so the protein in hemp is made out of the same protein found in egg whites and the same protein that's found in our blood plasma, so it's really bioavailable, it's really easy to digest. The fats in hemp, it has about 90% polyunsaturated fatty acids, so and it has a really good balance of omega-3 and 6, which is really good for human and optimal health. And then, it's full of magnesium, iron, zinc, and a range of other really beneficial nutrients as well. So that's the seed side of things. On the therapeutic side of things, so both the seeds and the therapeutics are from the flower, so the top of the plant, where buds, I guess, would be one way to talk about it, but it's sort of the flowering head of the plant. That's where the seeds and the compounds come from. And so when I mentioned that hemp has less than 1% THC, in cannabis, there's over 550 compounds in the plant. And so hemp still has those other 550 odd compounds can still be found in hemp. So but that one compound has been responsible for the prohibition that we've sort of faced for the last 80 years, which is just crazy to think about. But I think that was predominantly because they just didn't really understand how to classify, what the compounds were and what's good and what's bad, because it looks the same, smells the same, pretty much everything's the same, but it just doesn't have that one compound in it. So yeah, it's an incredibly versatile crop, just endless uses that you can get from the one crop. And I think that's why it's been such an important commodity sort of throughout human history. So there's I think about 8,000 years is the furthest back where they found evidence of hemp. So they found seeds in Japan 8,000 years ago, and they've found pottery in China as well from about 4,000 BC. And they actually don't know where hemp originated from because it was traded so much back in the day that they actually don't know where it originated from because it was such an important commodity. So yeah, it can basically clothe you, it can heal you, it can house you, and it can feed you as well. So yeah, the other component of the plant where you've got the flowering head where you have the seeds and you have the compounds, but then you have the stalk of the plant, which is where probably a lot of people understand what hemp is, and that's where you get the fibers. And so hemp is the second strongest natural fiber that we know of. The strongest is spider silk, which is impossible to grow at scale. So realistically, it's the strongest commercial natural fiber that we know of. And so when you have a stalk of a hemp plant, on the outside you have the sort of long fibers that you can turn into sort of textiles, and you can turn into non-woven materials, geomats, things like that. And it can be used as like a additive in concretes, and they use it in as a replacement to fiberglass in car door panels. So that's from the outer fiber, and then on the inside you have this sort of woody herd that you can create things like hempcrete is a big one. So there's a lot of construction going on now with hempcrete, and it's basically just this woody chip on the inside, some lime and water, and you have this, it's almost like a rammed earth material that sequesters carbon over time and actually hardens as well over time. So yeah, it's I could probably go on forever about the history of hemp, but it's been very important throughout civilization. That when the strength of your navy was the reason why you could rule empires. Back then the sail was made out of hemp, the ropes were made out of hemp, the oakum that made the ship hull waterproof was made out of hemp, the uniforms were made out of hemp. So it's always been a very important commodity throughout history. And even in the early days of the US colony, you could actually pay your taxes with hemp. So it's been very important throughout history. So this last sort of 80 years, I guess, of prohibition is sort of like a little blimp on the sort of human timeline with cannabis and hemp. And that sort of started out of in the late 1930s. It was actually, it depends on how deep you go on the conspiracy side of things of why it was outlawed, but it was kind of wrapped up in high THC cannabis, marijuana laws at the time, and some say that was around sort of racial reasons, because sort of the black community and the Mexican community coming to the US were consuming it, and don't think the government liked that. And so they decided to sort of outlaw it. Some people say that it was as a competition to, big paper mills and things like that, big forestry industry in the US. They were concerned that hemp was going to take market share. But I think one of the reasons as well was that just cotton ginning got really efficient at that point in time. So I think that's probably one of the reasons why hemp was sort of phased out a little bit. But interesting enough, 1940s, it got into, they legalized it again for the World War II because they needed rigging for ships. And then Richard Nixon came into power and they decided to have a big war on drugs. And so then that basically prohibited hemp from being produced again, and it made trading cannabis in international markets illegal, which then completely stopped all production almost all around the world because the United Nations came to make it illegal. So this kind of gets us to where we are almost today. We started to discover what THC is. There was a researcher in Israel that discovered what THC is and these compounds that are in cannabis. And he found out that these compounds interact with our system. We have a biological system in our body, and it's called the endocannabinoid system. And it's through our brain, it's through our organs, all throughout the periphery we have these receptor sites, and these compounds actually interact with those receptor sites. And our body actually produces our own cannabinoids. So part of the reason why breast milk is so calming for babies is because we actually transfer endocannabinoids to, like, our own bodies produce cannabinoids to the baby, and that's what has that calming effect, which is, pretty amazing. So I think the research that came from that is what kind of eroded the stigma that was so strong from the 60s and propaganda of the 60s and 70s. And so now we've got much better public perception of just cannabis more broadly, and then that has now opened up hemp, because everyone's saying, well, if cannabis isn't so bad, then varieties that don't have any of the drug component of it, we need to look into that. And so I guess that sort of gets to where we are today and why we're seeing like a major resurgence of the hemp industry globally. And I think it's a large part of that is because we're just discovering the potential uses, but it sort of also sits at this nexus of like sustainability, wellness, and sort of next generational products as well. Because of all these characteristics that it has the potential to replace or work as an alternative in so many different products and systems going forward. And I guess on the in the agronomy side of things as well, it works really well in farming systems. So it has a very short growing cycle. It's about 120 days from sowing to harvest. And the genetics can basically be grown from all the way down South Tasmania, all the way up into the tropics. And that's obviously the same in both latitudes. It's both hemispheres. We can use standardized equipment. So you just plant it normally like you would any other crop. You can go in there with for seeds, you just use a combine harvester, same sort of technique. And for fiber, you can use relatively simple equipment. You can just use silage choppers and things like that, which is pretty standardized agricultural equipment. And I think we are looking for more sustainable alternatives to current products. And so hemp really fits within sort of that world. And I think there's a lot of entrepreneurs now that are really getting excited by it, because they're seeing hemp as this opportunity to, create businesses and generate, generate wealth, but do it in the right way. So it's kind of hippie capitalism is what some people call it in the industry, where we're trying to do, trying to do capitalism, but do it in the right way. I guess that's kind of where we are today, and people are making all kinds of different products from it. They're doing like insulation material, they're doing sort of structured panels, they're doing geotextiles like I mentioned, and so we're seeing a huge growth globally in the industry. And I think that's just going to continue as well as the stigma starts to erode from the plant, because I think it was valued at about $6 billion or so this year, the entire hemp industry, and it's expected to grow to about $20 billion by 2030. But from what I sort of worked out on my trip, one of the largest, like the main thing that is restricting the industry from growing is just the stigma that's attached to the plant. Like if it was called anything else, we would not be in a position, it would be a huge industry already, but every time I go and speak to any government regulator, the first thing is, can you get high from it? And it's kind of funny the first couple of times that if you have like 150 of these conversations, it kind of gets a little bit old. And you just see, and there's so many unnecessary regulations and red tape that just is restricting the industry globally. And like one simple example is that we can't advertise on social network. Like we can't on none of the social platforms. Like on Google, we get classed as a narcotic. Meta, we've been constantly shadow banned, or just we can't actually advertise on there. We have to make second advertisement accounts that we can then point towards our webpage, and then they get banned. It's just this constant thing because we get labelled as narcotic drugs because there's no nuance to any of their understanding of hemp and what it is. I guess that would be probably the biggest sort of shadow over the industry and stopping it from growing. And I think also one of the issues was that a lot of, I guess, with lack of a better term, like snake oil salesmen got into the industry early on. And so, they sold the dream. They said it's going to be this amazing opportunity, raised all this money, did all this stuff, spent all the money, and then have nothing to show for it. And so now when the industry needs investment, when there's, people that are trying to actually develop these supply chains, they need capital to actually develop the supply chains. It's very difficult because they've been burned in the past. So that's an unfortunate sort of situation that the industry is in. But it shows huge potential for the future of the industry. Yeah.
So, what does Australia obviously manufactures some products from hemp? Do we import most of our hemp, or are we growing our own hemp? And what does a typical hemp farmer look like?
So we are importing a fair bit of hemp, but the production in Australia is really growing. Like, we would be one of the leaders in the world when it comes to definitely food production. There's sort of Canada, and then would be the largest in the world, but then Australia is probably not far behind that. And what it looks like for a farmer, it's mostly I think that the benefit of hemp is that it can work really well in just standard conventional systems. And so I know we're at a conference where we're talking more about regenerative systems, but the beauty of hemp is that it can have such a positive impact even in standard conventional farming systems. And so, we would love it to all be coming from regenerative farms or organic farms, but like, it's just very unlikely that you're going to get the scale that the industry needs to have an impact by doing so. If you want them to grow hemp, but then you also want them to change their production systems, it makes things very difficult. But with hemp, you basically sow the crop. Some farmers do a knockdown, so they'll do a glyphosate knockdown. Not great, but they do that. And then they'll sow directly into the stubble of whatever was in there prior. And then there's one spray at the start, which is like a broadleaf spray. And then there's nothing else until the end of the harvest. Some farmers use like a natural biological for like a grub that comes in. It's an organic spray. But otherwise, that's it. Where you compare that to like a poppy crop or a potato crop, there's probably 15 to 20 sprays during the season. So it's very sustainable in that aspect, and very easy to integrate into these like rotations for farmers as well. So it makes it quite simple for them to grow it.
And what's the situation at the moment? Is there enough supply to match the demand?
Yeah, there's enough supply. The growing of hemp isn't the difficult part. It's actually establishing the markets, because it's very hard to educate people when you can't actually advertise. And so there's actually been, like, in every market, there's been this sort of hype cycle that's happened. So in the US, they legalized it in 2018, and they actually legalized the production of the compounds in the plant. So in Australia, the compounds have to be grown under a medical cannabis framework, so it's very restricted in our nanny state of Australia. But in the US, you could actually extract and put that in foods and drinks and everything you can think of. Any kind of consumer packaged good you can think of had CBD in it. But then there was, again, that investment wave, and all that built up a lot of supply, and the demand just didn't sort of match the supply. So you had a massive sort of drop in the cost, and that, a lot of farmers got burnt and things like that. Similar kind of happened in Canada with food. It sort of happened in Australia in the last couple of years with the food industry. Everyone just had these like amazing aspirations of what the industry is going to do, and the potential revenue and sales, but it just didn't quite eventuate. But now we've definitely seen like a stabilization in that, and so it's just sort of growing steadily. Yeah.
And does the government assist growers and the industry in developing the market at all? Like, surely they can see the potential for Australian farming, in terms of adding value to the overall, GDP?
Yeah, actually, surprisingly, we have had a lot of help. So especially in Tasmania, they've been very supportive of the industry more broadly. They've supported the Hemp Association. They've supported a number of different businesses with low interest loans and grant funding as well. And we have AgriFutures as well, which is a big government organisation, which is sort of helping to promote the research in the industry. So we're definitely getting a lot more support than most other countries around the world, which is really positive to see. But we always you need so much more, because there's so much potential, but it's very hard to communicate that. And where do you actually put that funding? Just for an example, just since I've been in the industry, the average yield of seed from hemp was about 700 kilos per hectare. Just with agronomy improvements, no improvements in genetics, the average yield's about 1,500 kilos per hectare, which is just unheard of in any other cropping. And that's and we haven't even integrated anything to do with genetics in Australia yet. So there's new genetics coming out of the US, which is just using standard techniques, using other agricultural commodities, which is just hybridization. So it's not GMO, nothing nefarious. It's just literally just hybridization and getting hybrid vigor, which will then double yields, which then means hemp, because the cost is probably the prohibitive thing at the moment, is the cost of seed. So we compete with like a pea protein, for example, with our hemp protein, and hemp protein would be a much higher quality protein, but most people just, when they are making food products, they go, oh, we want a plant-based protein, don't care what it is, whatever, just put it in there. It's all about cost. And so when we're 50% more than a pea protein, it makes it pretty challenging to, communicate that. And so we need to increase yields, because we want to make sure farmers don't get paid any less. We want to make sure farmers are still making a good dollar out of it. But there's hope on the horizon. Like if we can increase yields with hybrid genetics, we can probably increase that by over 100% or so. And then we start to compete with these other commodities that are probably more, not as sustainable as hemp. And then I think that's what we need to do as an industry, is really just get to scale, and then you get to that. You get more hemp into everyday items, and then that is where you have the impact. Yeah.
Where's the most value in terms of product? Is it in the food industry? Is it in the building industry? Like, where do you see the ROI in terms of using hemp? Which industry benefits most?
It's a hard one. I think immediately it's probably in, like, upon a per hectare basis, it's definitely in the extracts, because you can make up to $100,000 or more per hectare just growing hemp for extracts. But I think going forward, that market's probably not as large as what the food and fiber market will potentially be. I think food will be, probably be similar to like a flax seed, chia seed market. It's probably within that world. But the fiber market has this huge potential opportunity to do so much. I think there was an article back in the 60s around hemp, and there was 25,000 uses from the one plant, and a lot of those uses come from the fiber. So, I spoke about hempcrete, but you're talking about bioplastics. You're talking about you can do sustainable aviation fuels from hemp. There's people doing nanospun fibers that you can basically make like a hemp-based Kevlar material, so bulletproof material out of hemp. People are there's studies on treating the fibers, and you can actually conduct electricity, and they can make supercapacitors out of it. So yeah, it's almost endless. But again, it just comes back to you need people to actually fund the research to then commercialize that and actually bring it into the market. And so yeah, I think it just goes in stages. I think the low-hanging fruit initially in the industry will be your food, your extracts, and then your building materials, and maybe some form of like textiles. Like it'll probably be low quality textiles, at least in Australia. And then people will start to take that and then start to convert that into your insulation material, and then it will start to move into future next generational products. I think that's sort of where the market will go. It'll just take time and need investment. Yeah.
We might have some question time now. I think there's a few hands up, so fellow in the back.
I wasn't here for full discussions. I don't know the cost of seeds per hectare. What's in the size pasture hectares? I've got a debate to a hectare.
Okay. Yeah, okay. So the question was the cost of seed per hectare and what size of production you need to make it viable. Look, I think probably 10 hectares is probably where it makes sense, because unless you've got your own equipment, it would be 1 hectare if you have your own planting equipment and sowing equipment. But when you need a combine harvester, you're probably not going to be doing. If you own a combine harvester, you probably don't have 1 hectare of production. You've probably got 50. Most farmers we work with, 20 to 50 hectares, and they usually just do it when it's in between. Like they might have like a perennial pasture, and they might just do pasture improvement, and so they can cut silage in September, for example, and then they can plant hemp in November, and then they can harvest it in March, and then they can allow that to replant some pasture for the winter time, so it's got enough time to grow. Cost of seed, it's roughly about $300 to $400 a hectare. So to produce it, it's about $1,800 to $2,000 a hectare to produce, and then you're probably looking at about $5,000 a hectare, something like that is your gross. So it's not bad in 120 days. It's pretty good. And yeah, that's kind of where we're at. Yeah, well, I think the issue with the industry now is because it's so new. You can't just grow it and then just take it to the elevators and sell it into the market really easily. It's all done on contracting, which is inherently risky because you're hoping that a startup who's contracting for your grain is going to be able to pay you, on time and in full. And so that's been one of the problems with the industry in the early days, is that farmers, a business will go belly up and then farmers won't get paid. So it's just still not established enough to have global markets and then sell directly into. So I think we're a few years away from that. Yeah.
Just from an agronomy point of view, it's really only good for the soil as well, but obviously seeds prohibited for grazing crops and can also eat it.
Yeah, livestock can eat it. A lot of farmers actually they'll harvest a crop and then leave the stubble, and then they'll put sheep in. The sheep will eat the stubble. There is some research on the product, like actually consuming the entire plant with grazing, but that's still yet to be finished. And what the results are from that, we don't actually quite know yet. The problem with that is that the plants still have those compounds in it, and so if the animals are going to be for food, then the regulators, APVMA, is very restrictive on what you can feed them, because the safety studies haven't been done of, if they eat X amount, does that end up getting cannabinoids in the end product? So a lot of that research still needs to be done, which is restricting the industry. But a lot of our byproducts go into feeding animals. So the shells that we take off the seeds, a lot of that goes into animal feed. Yeah.
Yeah, just a question around, because the plant has so many uses, do people harvest the head and then use the stem and stuff for the fibre, or is that doable? And the other question is as well, is like, if you're, are there other similar plants with a similar kind of, more towards hempcrete, more around hempcrete, you can kind of grow a cover crop that actually have a similar uses as the hemp for building? So I know, because I know a friend's using lantana.
Okay.
In his hempcrete mix.
Okay, interesting. Yeah. Well, I think on the first question, so can you basically dual crop it? Can you get seeds and fibre from the same plant? And yes, you can. So in Tassie, right now, all of our farmers that we're growing for seeds are actually selling their stalk to a local processor who's turning that into building materials for hempcrete. You won't get the quality fibres that you need for like shirts and things like that. It's mostly for that inner herd that you use in hempcrete. But yeah, you can do dual cropping, and there's a future potential of getting the biomass off that crop as well. So you might be able to get 3 crops, like 3 commodities off the one crop, and we could actually potentially sell that green like leafy material that comes out of the header. We could potentially sell that to medical cannabis producers, to then they can do extracts on that and turn that into products. In regards to other crops that you could potentially use, that's probably outside my wheelhouse, but I know. Well, how many, like, straw and things like that, I imagine you can probably incorporate. But from, my knowledge, I think some people can turn depending on what the biomass is, you can turn it into like a activated carbon, so like a biochar, and then you can incorporate that into your hempcrete mix. And I know that helps with the structure of the hempcrete as well. Yeah.
Another question? Yeah. What are the irrigation requirements?
It's about 3 megalitres per hectare. Yeah. So I usually put about 10 mil a week on it, and then it kind of increase that a little bit up into flowering. And I guess the nutrients as well, like it's very similar to growing, like most agronomists kind of copycat on pea production. So it's a similar kind of nutrient requirement to peas. And the thing with hemp as well, a lot of people talk about hemp with, one of the things that you read online is, it's really good because it doesn't need anywhere near as much water as cotton, for example. And that's true, but it does need a fair amount of water. And you can do dry land cropping with hemp. You won't get the same result. So hemp's very malleable. So like the more you can give it, the more it'll give you. And you can see that in in cannabis production, for example, they use very intense production indoors with cannabis, and they push it really, really hard, and it can take it. It doesn't affect the plant. It actually just produces more. So it's the same in hemp production as well. And dry land in Australia, like the dream would be to be able to do dry land in Australia, because then, we can open up many more farms that we can work with, because obviously it brings costs down for us. It opens up more production areas, and then also because it improves soil structure, then you're opening up a whole new kind of aspect of benefiting soils too. So there's that aspect of it, but that works in, say, Canada and North America, where they've got snow melt, and so they can actually sow into moisture. But in Australia, we don't have that. We kind of we sow and hope and pray for rain. So it's a very different method. But there's some work being done in Australia actually to find varieties with deeper tap roots that we can use in more dryland agriculture. Yeah.
Two questions.
Yep.
To do with building materials. Do you know what the R value of the insulation is compared to pink backs or earth wool, comparatively?
No, I don't know the exact one, but I think it's within the range. The thing that's kind of restricting it at the moment is just cost. And that's kind of similar with all hemp products is the cost. So it has a fairly similar R value. But the people who are using it aren't your everyday consumers. It's people who actually care, and they want to create a sustainable home with sustainable materials. And so they're happy to pay that extra, say 10 or 20% on top. Yeah.
The other question was, have you, the compressed scoreboard from waste straw? Is there a lightweight version similar to that in hemp products? Something that's going to be used, for instance, like these tiny homes on wheels and these kind of mobile buildings? Yeah,
so the question was, is there a similar product in hemp to the compressed straw boards? And yeah, there is. There's work being done in Australia at the moment. There's a company that's actually making a range of different products, but it's mostly the sort of chipboard, compressed board, and then they can use that to make a whole suite of different products. And there's also people working on SIP panels as well, so as a replacement to concrete, and they can use hemp, and it's sometimes a blend with concrete as well, but it makes a much lighter material, and has the insulation properties as well, but is really easy to install too.
You mentioned the nanny state situation we live in Australia. Just wondering if you can comment on just what the application process is for producers to apply for the license or whatever it is to actually put in a crop.
Okay, so the question was, what is required on a license? What is required licensing-wise to be able to grow hemp? So in Australia, it varies state to state, but it's all fairly simple except for Queensland. It's a bit more difficult to grow it into Queensland. But in Tasmania, for example, it's a one-page form. And one-page form you fill out, and then you just have to do a national police check, and that's basically it. Yeah. What's that?
I thought there were audits that they do annual audits.
Definitely not in Tassie. In Tassie, they come and check crops though, so they'll come and test the crops. And we can grow. They prefer to have varieties that have been grown before, because then they can guarantee that it's not going to breach that 1% threshold. But they still come out and they just test every crop. So we've got pretty relaxed rules in comparison to the rest of the world in Tasmania. And that was because of a few sort of pioneers in the industry that, I think they got in the legislation before the government really understood what they were doing, which is good.
Associated with that, or is that part of the licensing cost?
You just got to pay the $40 for the national police check, and then that's it.
Onto the checks they do, the farmers' cost.
No. No, sorry. Well, it depends. So if the farmer's contracting with the party will pay for it. About $130, something like that. Yeah. There's someone locally that does it as well. Yeah.
This might sound like a weird question, you may have answered it a bit late, but do you have any major security issues or security costs associated with growing the hemp? Because I've heard lots of stories around people breaking into hemp crops and then trying to smoke it, crazy things. And I was wondering what the association, if you've had any problems with that, for one, and then what the costs of that would be.
Okay, yeah, so in relation to security costs and whether the people actually break in to try and steal the material. So security costs, we don't have any. It's basically just, we don't even have the amazing security of poppies on hemp. You know, like you go around Tassie and it's got a, you know, barbed wire fence and it's like a sign saying warning, keep out, and that's meant to keep people out of a poppy crop. But with hemp, no, it's just, you know, we can grow it next to the road. There's no issues because there's no drug abuse potential whatsoever. But that hasn't stopped people in the past from breaking in and taking crops. Like even the Hemp Association, we did a variety trial on the highway, on the Midlands Highway, down from Lonnie to here, and people had broken in and taken some of the crop, which is just so pointless. And in the early days, I know that when people didn't really know what was going on, they probably thought it was a drug crop. They broke in, and there's stories of them, you know, taking to the pub and selling it to people, and everyone like everyone going home and smoking it and being like, what is this? And going and getting their money back. So yeah, there's, I think people have sort of learnt that, you know, if it's growing, you know, in a paddock, yeah, it's not going to do much for you. Yeah. But yeah, on a medical cannabis side of things though, if you're doing it for like extracts and things, you pretty much need a 10-foot high fence with barbed wire and security cameras and swipe cards and the whole thing. Yeah. I'll go for you first, yeah.
Yeah, it's got less than 1% THC. What about CBD? I know that's become popular as well.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, so the question is, does it have CBD? And I guess all the other compounds that are in cannabis. It does, but most industrial varieties that we grow for seed or for fibre don't really have much in there. You might have, you know, a couple of percentage points of CBD or these other compounds. But you can get hemp genetics into Australia and grow them, and they are the same bushy type of plant that you would, as you know, you'd see as a standard cannabis crop, and you can get upwards of like 14 to even 20% CBD and CBG and all these other compounds in that, and you can grow that legally under a hemp license, but you can't extract. Like once you extract that material, then you need a medical cannabis license. Yeah, and you can't. Yeah, so it's that's the thing. You can grow it, you just can't really do anything with it. Yeah. Legally.
I think you said the numbers were worldwide 6 billion market, growing to 20 in 6 years. Mm-hmm. That seems like quite a jump for a stagnant infrastructure. Where is that growth headed, and how's it getting there?
Yeah, so the question's around how are we getting from $6 billion to 20 billion. I can't validate those numbers. That's just what I've sort of found online, obviously. But I think it's sort of on the back of it being at this sort of nexus of where we're heading as a population and what we're demanding in our goods. I think, you know, we want sustainable products. So we want sustainable proteins. You know, hemp seeds play into that market. We want sustainable materials. And so I guess hemp fibers play into that market as well. And then we're moving away from sort of conventional medicines into more focus on sort of alternate plant-based medicines. And so it kind of plays into all these sort of growth categories that we're seeing around the world. And I think wellness in general is just this, ever since COVID, everyone cares a lot about their health now. And so I think just wellness in general is just sort of really growing as well. So I think because of all of that, and I think because it's such a new industry, and as much as I say it's, you know, it's hard to get investment, there's still people willing to take a punt on hemp because they see the opportunity. And so, you know, I was in the US recently, and the amount of money that's being invested in that industry over there is staggering. And I'm concerned because a lot of that's going to the fiber production now. But yeah, so it's all, you know, it's concerning that there's going to be another hype cycle and, you know, people are getting burnt again. But, you know, people see the opportunity. And so I think that's sort of why you see this, you know, sort of growth trajectory for the industry. Yeah.
Seems like the bar to getting into growing it is fairly low. So are you seeing market gardeners, small scale operators doing it as more of just like growing it for a windbreak, for instance, or some kind of small multi-purpose crop? Are market gardeners getting into growing hemp? Not really, because I think the problem in a market garden, you could probably use it as a windbreak, definitely. And I know some people do grow their own just for their own construction, like they want to make their own hempcrete out of that, or rammed earth product out of the whole stalks. But to harvest it without more than a hectare, for example, you're probably going through with, I don't know if there's a miniature version of a combine harvester, but like you'd be almost hand threshing it and things like that to get the seeds out. So it's probably not
it's probably not really worth it for a very small scale gardener. Different if you're growing it for like CBD and other products. There's ways to extract it. There's ways to extract it that are within the laws. So you can't use like alcohol and solvents to extract it, but you can mechanically separate the material from that. So if you wanted to make your own medicine, you can, and there's plenty of people around Tasmania that are making their own medicine, like whether they're doing it the right way or the wrong way, that's up to them. So that would probably be, if you're a small scale gardener, you would probably be growing it for the, therapeutic components, medicinal stuff, it's kind of like you sort of can, but it's like very grey.
So how would you prove if you were growing a hemp with less than 1%? How could you prove that if you're growing it in your backyard? Like, say, for example, if I had 5 acres and I want to grow a crop to make my own hemp bake, build a house, how would I prove that? Like, do you have to prove that it's less than 1%?
Well, you would have to get the variety. To grow the variety, you'd need to have some form of documentation to say that it's not going to breach the 1% threshold, which most people who supply genetics will be able to provide you with that. And then also the government will come in, or like the regulators will come and test the crop as well to prove that it hasn't breached the 1% threshold.
And then on that note, if you had, say, 5 acres, how much of that would need to be planted up, say, to build a 3-bedroom house? Or is that something you can ever?
That's probably not a question for me, like exacts around that, but depending on it's very dependent on the variety. And Tasmania is good for not the best place for fibre because fibre takes so food, it's about 120 days. Fibre is more like 150 or so. Plus you need to cut it, and it goes through a process where you cut it and you actually leave it in the field, and it's called retting. And the retting process allows the biology in the soil to actually start to separate to break down the lignins and things in the product, which helps you separate the outer fibre from the inner herd. So you're probably looking at 180 days, and it's starting to get pretty wet in Tassie by that point. But for example, in Victoria, there's some crops that did 18 tonnes to the hectare. So huge, 4.5 metre tall plants across 100 hectares of production. It's pretty cool to see. But it's all, I don't know how much you would need for your own home. But I think from that, from that you probably get about 40 to 50% of the weight you get as the building material that you would use for hempcrete. So I can't really answer that question, sorry.
Any other questions? Great. Okay, well, put your hands together for Tim.
Thank you.